The wind was a fury, a physical thing that scoured Redemption Gulch with grit and malice. It screamed down the single dusty street, peeling paint from false-fronted buildings and forcing the very air to shimmer over the scorched red earth. Dust, fine as powdered rust, seeped through every crack and keyhole, coating every surface with a film of desolation. It was the taste of dust and regret on the wind, a wind that seemed to mourn the town's very name. Inside the territorial bank, the storm's howl was a muffled beast, but the oppressive silence was just as loud. Serafina Hayes stood before the teller's cage, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles were white stones. The air was thick with the scent of old paper-oiled steel and the faint cloying smell of the teller's pomade. She was here to close her mother's account. The last of it. A sum so pitifully small, it felt like an insult to the memory of the woman who had saved every stray penny. That's everything, Mrs. Croft the teller, a young man named Elias, with a perpetually nervous twitch, said, avoiding her eyes. He still used her married name, a habit the whole town clung to, as if to remind her of a failure she could never escape. "It's Miss Hayes now," she corrected him, her voice a dry whisper that was nearly lost to the wail of the wind. The correction felt hollow. She was neither Croft nor Hayes, but a ghost adrift between two houses that were no longer homes. Elias flushed, pushing the small stack of bills and coins through the grate. As Serafina's fingers reached for the money, the bank's heavy doors burst inward with a deafening crash. 3 men stormed in their faces, obscured by grimy bandanas, the dust storm their accomplice. Panic erupted like a flock of startled birds. Elias dove for the floor. A woman in the corner shrieked. But the man who led them moved with a terrifying calm, his sheer bulk filling the doorway. He was not a common thief. There was an air of ownership about him, as if he were merely collecting a debt. He pulled down his bandana, and Serafina's blood turned to ice. Corcoran Holt. His face was a jumble of fleshy folds, but his eyes were small and sharp, glittering with a cruel intelligence that belied his slovenly appearance. He was the wealthiest, most feared man in the territory. A land baron who consumed ranches the way a locust consumes a field. A lovely day for a withdrawal. Holt boomed his voice, a gravelly rumble that seemed to shake the floorboards. His men, rough and brutal, were already behind the counter, stuffing cash into canvas bags. But Holt's gaze wasn't on the money. It swept the room, dismissive of the cowering townsfolk, until it landed on Serafina. A slow, predatory smile spread across his lips. He walked toward her, his expensive boots leaving prints in the fine layer of dust on the floor. He moved not with the urgency of a robber, but with the deliberate pace of a man savoring a long-awaited moment. "Serafina Hayes," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Just the woman I was hoping to see." Fear cold and absolute seized her. This wasn't random. He knew her. He had sought her out. Her mind raced, but there was no logic, no reason for this. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could smell the stale sweat and expensive cloying cologne that clung to him. His greedy eyes roamed over her, not with lust, but with something far more chilling, a look of triumphant possession. His gaze fixed on the delicate silver locket resting against the hollow of her throat. "That's a pretty thing," he said, his voice turning oily and soft. Before she could react, his thick fingers shot out and closed around the locket. The chain bit into her skin. "No," she gasped, her hands flying up to protect it. "Please, it was my mother's." The plea only seemed to delight him. Was it now, he mused, a flicker of dark satisfaction in his eyes? With a single brutal tug, he ripped it from her neck. The chain snapped, stinging her skin like a whip. He held the silver oval in his meaty palm, rubbing his thumb over its smooth, worn surface. A pretty thing. He repeated, his smile widening to reveal a row of yellowed teeth. He held it up to the light, admiring it, as if it were a prize he had just won. It deserves a home where it will be appreciated. He turned, his men falling in behind him, their bags heavy with the bank's money. At the door, he paused and looked back at her, his eyes locking with hers. He gave the locket a final possessive look, then slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. The gesture was an act of profound violation, a theft far more personal than all the money in the bank. Then, as quickly as they had come, they were gone, swallowed by the swirling red dust. The bank was a tableau of shock and chaos. Elias was babbling, the woman was sobbing. But Sarafina felt nothing but the raw, burning welt on her neck and the horrifying emptiness on her chest where her mother's last touch used to be. The stolen money meant nothing. Her own paltry savings, now scattered across the floors, meant nothing. He had taken the one thing that connected her to a past where she had been loved. He had targeted her. And in the heart of the howling storm, a new terrible certainty took root in her soul. This was not over. It was just the beginning. The walk back to her father's ranch was a battle against the wind. It tore at her dress and whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes with dust and unshed tears. The landscape was a hostile blur of red and brown, unforgiving and vast. By the time she reached the homestead, the rage of the storm had lessened, but the one inside her was only beginning to build. The silence in the Hayes homestead was a heavy, smothering blanket. It was a silence born not of peace, but of profound, simmering disappointment. And for 5 years, it had worn her name. She had returned here after her husband, Sterling Croft, had cast her aside, his public declaration of her barrenness echoing through the territory like a death knell. Her father, Bartholomew Hayes, had taken her back not out of love, but to contain the disgrace, to put a fence around his failed investment. She found him in the main room, polishing a silver belt buckle, his movements methodical and severe. Bartholomew was a man carved from the unforgiving landscape itself, all harsh angles and unyielding principles. To him, everything had a purpose, a value. A horse that couldn't be ridden was glue. A cow that gave no milk was meat. A daughter who couldn't produce an heir was a liability. She didn't tell him about the bank, about Holt, about the locket. It would do no good. Her personal pain was a currency he did not trade in. She simply started the evening chores, the familiar motions, a hollow comfort. The room smelled of stale coffee and old wood smoke, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Her mother, Agnes, sat by the hearth, her knitting needles clicking like nervous insects, a pale reflection of her husband's iron will. She offered no comfort, only worried glances that skittered away the moment they were met. "He is coming this afternoon," Bartholomew stated, not looking at her. The buckle gleamed under his relentless cloth. The pronoun hung in the air, a specter that had haunted their meager conversations for a week. Sarafina's hands, raw from lye soap, stilled over the dough she was kneading. A cold dread, separate from the fresh horror of the bank robbery, crept up her spine. "Father," Corcoran Holt Bartholomew said finally, looking up. His eyes were the color of faded denim and just as hard. The name struck her like a physical blow. Holt, the man from the bank, the man with her mother's locket in his pocket. It couldn't be a coincidence. He's a man of means. Her father continued, his voice, a cold, flat monotone. A widower. His property borders the southern pass. He requires a housekeeper, a woman to manage his affairs. The words were carefully chosen, but the meaning was as sharp and ugly as a shard of broken glass. Holt was nearly 70, a corpulent, wheezing man whose first 2 wives had died under mysterious whispered circumstances. He didn't want a housekeeper. He wanted a possession. The robbery, the theft of her locket, it was all part of his plan. He was showing everyone that he could take whatever he wanted. The blood drained from her face. "You cannot be serious." "Do not play the fool, girl," Bartholomew snapped, setting the buckle down with a sharp crack. "You are used goods, damaged. No man of standing will have you. Your purpose as a wife has failed." Sterling made that clear to the entire territory. "Holt is offering a solution. He will take you off my hands. He is willing to compensate me for the trouble and expense of your upbringing." Compensate. The word was vile, transactional. He was selling her to the man who had terrorized her, who had stolen from her just hours before. The world tilted, the oppressive silence in the room becoming a deafening roar in her ears. Mother Serafina pleaded, turning to the woman by the fire. Agnes refused to meet her eyes. "Your father knows what is best, Serafina," she murmured to her lap. "Mr. Holt is a respected man. You will be provided for." Provided for. Serafina's voice trembled with a rage she hadn't felt in years. "I will be his slave. You know the stories about him. Stories are for gossips and children." Bartholomew thundered, rising to his full imposing height. "The arrangement is made. Holt has been generous. He is canceling my debt at the general store. A substantial debt, I might add." The cruelty of it stole her breath. A debt. She looked at the man who gave her life and saw only a merchant appraising his wares. She saw the years of trying to please him, of striving to be the perfect daughter, all of it dissolving into a simple, cold calculation of profit and loss. She was a loss he was finally cutting. Tears welled hot and useless. "I will not go." Bartholomew crossed the room in 2 strides. He didn't strike her. His control was too absolute for such messy displays. Instead, he gripped her chin, his fingers digging into her jaw, forcing her head up. His voice was a low, menacing hiss. "You will. You will go with him, and you will be gracious. You will do your duty as he sees fit. You are a Hayes, and you will not bring further shame upon this house by acting like a hysterical filly. Is that understood?" His grip was like iron. His eyes held no pity, no fatherly affection. They were the eyes of a stranger, sealing a deal. Defeated, she gave a single jerky nod. He released her, and she stumbled back against the table. The dough she had been kneading, a symbol of the domestic life she was supposed to build, now seemed a formless, pale mockery. The decision was made. The papers, she knew, were already drawn. Her life was a debt to be settled, and Corcoran Holt was coming to collect. That night, sleep was a distant country she could not reach. Every creak of the house, every howl of the dying wind, was the sound of Holt's approach. Her father's words echoed in her mind, a litany of her failures. Damaged goods, a liability, a fine price for a barren woman. The sale was to be finalized the next day. Holt was to collect her at noon. Her, his new property. She lay in her narrow bed, staring into the oppressive darkness, the raw spot on her neck a constant burning reminder of the locket. It wasn't just a piece of silver. It was the anchor to her past, to a time before she was a commodity. Holt had taken it to show her she owned nothing, not even her own history. And her father was about to prove him right. A quiet resolve born of sheer terror began to harden within her. She would not be sold. She would not be Holt's creature trapped in his mansion under the weight of his appetites. She would not let her father profit from her misery. If the world saw her as worthless, then she had nothing left to lose. Slipping out of bed, she moved with a stealth she didn't know she possessed. She dressed in her sturdiest dress and worn boots. From a loose floorboard beneath her bed, she retrieved a small deerskin pouch. Inside were the coins from her mother's account, the money she had managed to scoop from the bank floor in the confusion. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The house was tomb silent. She crept past her parents' room, the sound of her father's heavy snores, a repulsive rhythm of betrayal. She didn't pause to look at the woman who had given her life, only to stand by and watch it be sold. There was nothing left to say. In the kitchen, she packed a small bundle, a loaf of bread, a canteen of water, and a sharp skinning knife from the pantry. It was a pathetic arsenal against the vast, hostile wilderness that awaited her. But it was all she had. The back door groaned in protest as she opened it, the sound as loud as a gunshot in the stillness. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, listening. Only the chirping of crickets answered. She slipped out into the cold, moonless night and ran. She didn't run toward the road to Redemption Gulch. That would be the first place they would look. Instead, she headed west toward the distant, hazy mesas that marked the edge of Apache land. It was a place of wildness and fear, a land of stories told to frighten children. But tonight, the unknown dangers of the wilderness were a comfort compared to the known horrors that lay behind her. The land was treacherous in the dark. Thorny bushes tore at her dress, and loose rocks threatened to twist her ankle with every step. She moved with frantic energy, fueled by adrenaline and the terrifying image of Holt's leering face. She imagined his carriage arriving at noon, her father's cold satisfaction, Holt's meaty hand closing around her arm. The thought propelled her forward deeper into the scrubland. Dawn was a pale gray smear on the eastern horizon when she heard the sound of horses. Not the slow, steady plod of a traveler, but the urgent, purposeful gait of pursuit. Panic, sharp and metallic, flooded her senses. Her father. He must have discovered her gone. He would not allow his transaction to be spoiled. He would hunt her down like stray cattle. She scrambled for cover, diving into a thicket of mesquite, its thorns scratching her face and arms. Peeking through the leaves, she saw two riders silhouetted against the growing light. They were her father's ranch hands, their rifles held ready across their saddles. They were tracking her. She held her breath, trying to make herself small and visible. But they were good at their work. They followed her clumsy trail with an unnerving ease. The lead rider pointed directly at her hiding place. Over there, his voice carried on the still morning air, spooked some quail. Her time was up. As they urged their horses forward, a sound sharp and clear split the morning air from the rocky ridge above them. A perfect imitation of a hawk's cry. The ranch hands pulled up short, their eyes scanning the rocks. The call came again, this time from a different spot further to the north. It was a hunter's signal, a sign that someone else was in these hills. White men did not venture this deep into the territory to hunt, not unless they had a death wish. This was Apache land. The two men exchanged a nervous glance. Their task was to retrieve a runaway girl, not to start a fight with warriors who knew this land as well as their own faces. The lead rider hesitated, his gaze shifting between the mesquite thicket and the silent watching ridges. Then a flicker of movement on the northern ridge, a shadow detaching itself from the rock. It was too far to see clearly, but the silhouette was unmistakable, a man on foot, lean and powerful, holding a bow. He stood for a moment, a silent, unnerving presence, then melted back into the landscape. That was enough. "Ain't worth it," the second rider muttered, his hand straying to the pistol at his hip. "Let the desert have her." The other man grunted in agreement. With one last wary look at the ridge, they turned their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and the scent of fear in their wake. Serafina remained frozen in the thicket, her body trembling with the aftermath of terror. She didn't know who the man on the ridge was, or why he had intervened. A diversion, a warning, whatever his reason, he had saved her. She waited until the sound of the riders had faded completely before crawling out of the mesquite, scratched and shaking. She looked up at the ridge, but there was nothing, only the sun-bleached rock and the vast, empty sky. She was alone again, but she was free. For now. Exhausted, lost, and hunted, she pushed herself to her feet and continued her desperate journey west into the heart of an unknown land, drawn toward the shadow that had just given her a chance to survive. For 2 days she walked. The initial terror of the escape gave way to a deeper, more primal struggle for survival. The sun was a relentless hammer beating down from a brassy sky. The air shimmered over the scorched red earth, and the landscape of rock and thorn offered little shade and less comfort. Her water was gone by the end of the first day, her lips cracking her throat, a desert of its own. The bread was a dry memory. The world shrank to the next step and the one after that. She was delirious with thirst and exhaustion when she stumbled into the shallow canyon. A thin trickle of water, a miracle in this parched land, seeped from a rock face, pooling in a small sandy basin. She fell to her knees and drank the lukewarm water, tasting sweeter than any wine. She drank until her stomach ached, then collapsed into the thin strip of shade offered by the canyon wall. It was there he found her. She was drifting in and out of a feverish sleep when a shadow fell across her. Her eyes fluttered open. A man stood over her, the sun at his back, turning his form into a dark, imposing silhouette. It was the man from the ridge. Up close, he was tall and lean, his body honed by a life she could barely imagine. His black hair was long held back by a simple leather band. He wore buckskin trousers and a plain cotton shirt, the attire of a man who straddled two worlds. His face was striking with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, but it was his eyes that held her. They were dark and intelligent, and they held an expression of profound, weary sorrow. He carried the bow she had seen, and a brace of rabbits was slung over his shoulder. Panic flared, but she was too weak to move, too weak to scream. He simply watched her for a moment, his gaze taking in her torn dress, her scratched face, her utter state of collapse. He knelt, moving with a fluid grace, and offered her his own canteen. "You are far from your home," he said. His voice was quiet, yet it resonated in the still air. It was low and measured, with only a trace of an accent. She took the canteen with a trembling hand and drank. This water was cool and clean. "I have no home," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. His dark eyes studied her, and in their depths she saw not pity, but a flicker of recognition, as if he understood the particular brand of desolation that had driven her here. "You are the woman they were hunting," he stated, not a question. She nodded, too exhausted for lies. He said nothing for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the unforgiving landscape. "This land does not forgive mistakes. To stay here is to die." He rose to his feet. "Come. There is a place with water and shade. It is not far." He offered his hand. It was a strong hand, calloused and capable. An offer, not a demand. Remembering the brutal grip of her father and the meaty paw of Holt, she hesitated. But looking at his sorrowful eyes, she saw no threat, only a quiet dignity. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and surprisingly gentle as he helped her to her feet. He led her through the labyrinth of canyons, following paths invisible to her eyes. He moved with an effortless economy of motion, never seeming to tire. He adjusted his pace to hers, often stopping to allow her rest. He shared his remaining water, and when they stopped as dusk began to bleed across the horizon, he built a small smokeless fire and roasted a rabbit, sharing the meat with her without a word. The place he called home defied all her expectations. tucked into a small, sheltered valley fed by a spring that nourished a grove of cottonwood trees, was a single solid cabin. It was built of stone and timber, with a well-made roof and a sturdy door. A small, neatly tended garden grew to one side, and a simple corral held 3 horses, who whinnied a soft welcome. It was a place of solitude and profound peace. "This is my home," he said. "You are safe here." His name, he told her, was Cale, just Cale. He offered her sanctuary. Not marriage, not a bargain, not a transaction. Just shelter. He seemed to sense her turmoil, the deep well of fear and mistrust that her life had dug within her. He gave her space, maintaining a respectful distance. He gave her the cabin's only bed, a comfortable pallet of thick furs, while he took a bedroll by the fire. He made no demands, asked for no explanations. He simply shared his food and his shelter, treating her with a quiet courtesy that was utterly foreign to her. In the days that followed, a slow-burn trust began to develop. She learned the rhythms of his life. He was a man of profound self-sufficiency, moving through his world with a quiet competence. A silent bond grew between them, forged in shared meals and the vast, quiet expanse of the desert night. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, she found herself speaking of the locket. The words tumbled out a torrent of grief and rage she hadn't realized she'd been holding back. "He took it from me," she said, her voice trembling. "It was my mother's, silver oval-shaped with a small wildflower etched on the front. It was all I had left of her." Kyle listened, his dark eyes fixed on the fire, his expression unreadable. He had seen Holt in town after the bank robbery, had seen the man preening in the saloon, boasting of his new acquisition. He had seen the silver locket dangling from Holt's waistcoat. "This man, Holt Cale," said, his voice a low rumble. "His feud is with you." "I don't know," she confessed. "My father, he owed him a debt. He was going to give me to him to settle it. That's why I ran. But the robbery, the locket, it felt personal. It felt like a punishment." A strange look passed over Cale's face, a flicker of something she couldn't decipher. The pieces didn't fit. A man like Holt didn't orchestrate a bank robbery and risk a hanging offense to claim a woman he was already set to acquire legally. There was something more at play, a deeper, uglier story beneath the surface. He said nothing of his suspicions to her, not wanting to add to her pain. But a seed of purpose was planted. Her pain had become his concern. The locket was more than a piece of silver. It was a symbol of her violation, and retrieving it had become a matter of honor. While Serafina slowly healed in the sanctuary of the valley, Holt's rage festered. Her escape was an intolerable insult. The news that she had vanished into the wilderness, likely dead, was not enough. He wanted her found. He wanted his property returned. More than that, he wanted the Apache who, his sources told him, had been seen near where she disappeared. He put a price on Cale's head, a bounty that drew the territory's worst men like flies to carrion. The threat materialized a month later. Kyle had ridden to a distant trading post for supplies, a journey that took 2 days. He left Serafina with a rifle and strict instructions not to leave the valley. On the 2nd day of his absence, she was tending the garden when she heard the telltale sound of a shod horse stumbling on the rocky path leading into the valley. It was not Cale's horse. Her heart leapt into her throat. She grabbed the rifle from the cabin and ducked behind the stone wall of the corral, her hands slick with sweat. A man rode into the clearing. He was gaunt and filthy, with a cruel, hawk-nosed face and dead eyes that scanned the valley with a predatory stillness. A bounty hunter. He saw the cabin, the tended garden, the signs of life. A greasy smile spread across his face. "I know you're in there, girl," He called out, his voice a rasp. "Holt wants you back. Come out nice and easy, and I won't have to hurt you much." Seraphina's mind raced. Kyle was gone. She was alone. The terror that had propelled her out of her father's house threatened to paralyze her now. But then she thought of Holt's meaty hands, of the life that awaited her if this man took her. A different feeling rose through the fear, a cold, hard fury. She had not survived the desert to be dragged back to her cage. "He's got a price on that Apache's head, too." And the man continued dismounting and starting toward the cabin. "I'll take you first, then wait for him. A profitable day." As he reached the cabin door, Seraphina made her choice. She wasn't the timid girl from Redemption Gulch anymore. She had learned from Cale, had watched his patience, his knowledge of the land. She cocked the rifle, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet valley. "Take one more step and you're a dead man," she called out, her voice shaking but clear. The bounty hunter froze, then let out a harsh laugh. "A little filly with a gun. Holt didn't mention you had spirit." He drew his pistol. "Come on out now." He kicked the cabin door. It held. He kicked it again, the wood groaning. He was going to break it down, and she knew she couldn't face him in the open. She had one chance. Remembering what Cale had taught her about diversions, about using the land, she bolted from behind the corral, running not away from the valley, but deeper into it toward the thick grove of cottonwoods by the spring. As she expected, the man's greed and arrogance made him follow, wanting the satisfaction of the chase. He plunged into the trees after her. The grove was dark, the ground soft and uneven. She knew this place. He did not. She scrambled up the rocky incline on the far side of the spring, a place she and Kyle had explored. Halfway up, she dislodged a cascade of loose rocks, sending them tumbling down the path behind her. The bounty hunter yelled in surprise and pain as the rock struck his leg, sending him sprawling. His pistol flew from his hand, clattering into the undergrowth. Seraphina didn't stop. She reached the top of the incline and looked back down. He was struggling to his feet, cursing, his leg clearly injured. He looked up and saw her, a silhouette against the sky. His face was a mask of pure hatred. "You'll pay for that, you witch." At that moment, a second figure appeared at the valley entrance. Kyle. He had returned early. He took in the scene in an instant, the bounty hunter's horse, the broken cabin door, Seraphina on the rocks. The bounty hunter saw him too, and his face went pale. He scrabbled desperately in the dirt for his lost pistol. Cale notched an arrow to his bow, to the movement a single fluid motion. "Leave this place," he said, his voice deadly calm. The bounty hunter finally found his gun and brought it up, firing a wild shot that ricocheted off the rocks near Cale's head. Before he could fire again, Cale's arrow was loosed. It flew with impossible speed and precision, striking the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him to the ground. He screamed, dropping the pistol once more. Cale walked toward the whimpering man, his face a grim mask. He retrieved the pistol, then pulled the arrow from the man's shoulder with a clean, hard jerk that made him pass out from the pain. Cale tied the unconscious man to his own horse. He would leave him miles from here with a canteen of water and a long, painful walk back to civilization, a warning to any others who might follow. He then turned and walked to the base of the rocks where Seraphina had scrambled down. She was trembling, the rifle still clutched in her hands. He gently took it from her. He looked from her to the broken cabin door and back again, his eyes filled with a mixture of fury at her endangerment and a deep, profound respect. "You were brave," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was scared," she whispered. He reached out and his hand gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a streak of dirt. It was the first time he had touched her with such tenderness. The barrier between them, already weakened, crumbled into dust. They had faced a threat together. They had defended their home. In that shared moment of violent survival, their bond forged in quiet sanctuary was tempered into something unbreakable. She was no longer a guest he was protecting. She was his partner. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he would let no one harm her ever again. The encounter with the bounty hunter changed everything. The unspoken walls between them dissolved, replaced by a quiet intimacy that wove itself into the fabric of their daily lives. The formal distance vanished. One night after a long day spent repairing the cabin door and reinforcing the windows, he didn't lay his bedroll by the fire. He simply came to the bed and lay beside her. It was a silent question, and her silent acceptance was the answer. Theirs was not a union of passionate abandon, but a slow, gentle coming together of two people who had known profound loss and loneliness. It was a rediscovery of solace, a quiet affirmation of life. For Serafina, it was a revelation. With Kale, she felt seen, valued, and for the first time in her life, truly whole. One day, Kale returned from a solitary hunt, a strange, grim look on his face. He had tracked the bounty hunter far enough to ensure he was gone, but on his return journey, he'd skirted the edges of Redemption Gulch. Hidden on a ridge, he had watched Corcoran Holt. The man was in the town square, directing the construction of a new saloon, and on his waistcoat, glinting in the harsh sunlight, was the silver locket. Seeing it again, seeing it on the man who had torn it from Serafina's neck, ignited a cold fire in Kale's gut. It was a constant taunting symbol of Holt's victory. That night, he made a decision. "I'm going to town," he told Serafina. Fear immediately coiled in her stomach. "It's not safe. They'll be looking for you." "I will not be seen," he assured her. "But there is something I must do." He didn't say more, but she saw the resolve in his eyes and knew it was useless to argue. Kale was a ghost. He slipped into Redemption Gulch under the cover of a moonless night, moving through the alleyways and shadows with an innate mastery of stealth. Holt's new house was on the edge of town, a garish two-story monstrosity that was more fortress than home. Kyle watched it for hours, learning the patterns of the guards Holt had hired, noting the master bedroom window Holt left open to catch the cool night air. Getting inside was a risk, but it was a calculated one. Like a shadow, he scaled a trellis, slipped through the open window, and entered the sleeping giant's room. The air was thick with the scent of whiskey and Holt's cloying cologne. The man himself was a mountain in the bed, his wheezing snores filling the room. And there, draped over a valet stand with his waistcoat, was the locket. Kale took it, his movements silent and precise. But as his fingers closed around the cool silver, his curiosity, piqued by Serafina's story of Holt's strange personal vendetta, made him pause. The locket felt heavier than it should. He found the tiny hidden clasp. He gently prized it open. Inside, there was no miniature portrait, no lock of hair. Instead, one side held a small, tightly folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. The other side, the silver backing, was covered with a fine, spidery inscription. Holding it to the faint moonlight, filtering through the window, he could just make out the words. A date from 25 years ago. And beneath it, two sets of initials entwined, B.H. and C.H. Bish, Bartholomew Hayes. That was expected. But C.H. Serafina's mother was named Agnes. Her name did not start with a C. Kale stared at the inscription, a sudden chilling understanding beginning to dawn. This locket was not Serafina's mother's. It was a lie. A lie Serafina herself had believed her entire life. This was something else entirely. This was a key. He closed the locket, slipped it into his pouch, and vanished back into the night as silently as he had come. He returned to the valley just before dawn. Serafina had been awake all night, sick with worry. When he appeared in the doorway safe, she rushed into his arms. "Did you—" She began but stopped when he pulled the locket from his pouch and placed it in her hand. Tears of relief streamed down her face. She clutched it to her chest, a piece of her past restored. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Cale watched her, his expression grim. "Serafina," he said gently, "open it." Confused, she fumbled with the clasp. When it opened, she stared, her brow furrowed. She saw the inscription, the strange initials. "CH." She murmured. "Who is that?" She carefully unfolded the tiny piece of paper. It was a legal document in miniature, a deed of partnership for a mining claim signed by Bartholomew Hayes and a man named Corcoran Holt. She looked up at Cale, her eyes wide with confusion. "I don't understand. My father told me this was my mother's. He said he gave it to her when I was born." "Your father has lied to you," Cale said, his voice soft but firm. "This locket is the reason for everything. Holt's hatred is not for you. It is for your father." The mystery was a stone in his hand, heavy and cold. He knew there was only one place to find the truth. He had to speak with the elders of his tribe, the keepers of stories, who knew the histories of every major family, white and Apache, in the territory. Leaving Serafina with the locket and the bewildering questions it raised, Kyle rode to his people's camp, a journey he had not made in years. He was greeted with a mixture of surprise and respect. He sought out his mother's eldest sister, an old woman named Sansi, whose eyes held the wisdom of a century. He sat with her by her fire, showed her the locket, and told her the story. Sansi took the locket in her wrinkled hands, her fingers tracing the initials. A sad, knowing look came over her face. "Ah," she sighed, "the coyote and the hawk, a bitter tale." And then she told him the story, a story that Redemption Gulch had long forgotten or had been paid to forget. 25 years ago, Bartholomew Hayes and Corcoran Holt were not rivals, but ambitious young partners. They were the coyote and the hawk, clever and ruthless. Holt was the money and the vision. Hayes was the local man with the connections and the grit. Together, they discovered a rich silver vein in the mountains. This locket, Sansi explained, was a gift from Holt to his young wife Cora, to celebrate the partnership that was to make their fortune. The deed inside was her security. But Bartholomew was a coyote. He saw a way to have it all. He engineered a cave-in at the mine, faked documents to show it was worthless, and used Holt's despair to buy out his share for pennies on the dollar. He bankrupted Holt, leaving him disgraced and destitute. The true tragedy, Sansi said, came a month later. Ruined and forced to take work on a cattle drive, Holt returned to find his small homestead ravaged by sickness. His wife, Cora, CH, and their infant son had died unable to afford a doctor. Holt blamed Bartholomew not just for his ruin, but for the death of his family. He disappeared for many years. Sansi concluded, her voice a low whisper. When he returned, he had money from somewhere else and a heart full of poison. He has spent 20 years rebuilding his empire, all for one purpose: to destroy everything Bartholomew Hayes has built and everything he values. The final horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Cale. "Serafina," he breathed. "She is Bartholomew's only child," Sansi affirmed. "His bloodline, his legacy. To Holt, she is the final debt to be collected." Kyle's blood ran cold. He finally understood the depths of Holt's cruelty. It wasn't lust. It was a revenge so patient and meticulous, it was monstrous. He had waited for Serafina to grow up. He had likely been the one to plant the seeds of doubt about her fertility, whispering to the right people, ensuring the town doctor's diagnosis. He had orchestrated her failed marriage to Sterling Croft, isolating her, making her a social outcast, turning her into a damaged asset her father would be desperate to unload. He hadn't wanted to buy her to possess her. He'd wanted to buy her to destroy her, to end the Hayes line, and leave Bartholomew with nothing but the ashes of his legacy, just as Holt had been left with nothing all those years ago. The locket was the proof of his original betrayal. Holt had flaunted it not as a trophy of lust, but as a symbol of the vengeance he was about to complete. Cale rode back to the valley like the wind, the terrible truth of poison in his own heart. He had to tell Serafina. He had to prepare her. The storm Holt had been brewing for 25 years was about to break. The truth, when Kyle laid it bare, did not break Serafina. It galvanized her. The story horrifying as it was filled in the missing pieces of her life. Her father's coldness, her mother's perpetual fear, the suffocating sense that she was a disappointment, it all made a terrible kind of sense. She was not the center of her story. She was a pawn in a game of vengeance that had started before she was born. Her entire life had been a lie, built on a foundation of her father's treachery and her mother's silent complicity. The locket in her hand was no longer a symbol of her mother's love, but a testament to her father's sins. A strange, liberating calm settled over her. The shame that had defined her existence, the shame of her failed marriage, of her supposed barrenness, was not hers to carry. It belonged to the men who had used her for their own bitter purposes. But this new clarity was shattered by a change within her own body. A persistent queasiness in the morning, a deep, bone-weary fatigue. The signs were unmistakable, yet she denied them. The diagnosis of her barrenness was so deeply ingrained in her identity that the alternative was unthinkable. But as 1 month passed, and then a second, she could no longer ignore the truth. One evening, she took Kyle's hand and placed it on her still flat abdomen. "I think," she whispered, her voice thick with a joy so fierce it was painful the doctor in Redemption Gulch was wrong. The look on Kyle's face was one of stunned, dawning wonder. The deep sadness in his eyes was washed away by a wave of emotion so powerful it seemed to shake his entire being. He knelt before her, his hands resting on her belly, as if he could feel the miracle within. A child. Their child. A new life conceived in love and sanctuary. A defiant answer to all the lies and hatred. Their shared joy, however, was tempered by the grim reality of their situation. A child made the stakes infinitely higher. Holt's vengeance was not just about ending the Hayes bloodline. It was about ensuring Bartholomew had no legacy. A grandchild would be an intolerable offense. And news, even in the vast territory, had a way of traveling. Sansi, visiting the valley to bring a woman's tea for Serafina's morning sickness, saw the truth with her wise eyes. She spoke of it with pride in her camp. From there, an Apache trader carried the story to Redemption Gulch. The barren white woman was swelling with the Apache's child. The tale spread through the town like wildfire. For Corcoran Holt, it was the ultimate mockery. It was a public declaration that the woman he had sought to destroy was in fact whole, that the legacy he had plotted for decades to extinguish was poised to be reborn, mingled with the blood of a people he despised. His patient, simmering revenge boiled over into a murderous, all-consuming obsession. He would not be denied. He would ride to that valley and salt the earth himself. He would take the woman, erase the child, and burn the savage's world to the ground. He gathered his army, not lawmen but killers, claim jumpers, army deserters, and hawk-nosed gunmen like the one Kyle had already dispatched, all drawn by the promise of gold. And for a final sadistic twist, he sought out Sterling Croft. Serafina's ex-husband, a man already humiliated by his new wife, bearing him a daughter instead of a son, was now a town laughingstock. The news of Serafina's pregnancy was the final emasculation. Blinded by rage and wounded pride, Sterling agreed to ride with Holt's posse. The warning came on the wind, a rider from Cale's tribe breathing the words, "Holt is coming." With more than a dozen men, they ride at dawn. The peace of the valley was over. "You must go," Kyle said, his voice strained. "My people will hide you in the Stronghold Mountains." "No," Serafina said, her voice sharp and absolute. Her hand went to her belly, a protective shield. The frightened girl who had fled her father's ranch was gone. In her place was a woman who had faced down bounty hunters and the ghosts of her own past. "I will not run. I will not leave you. This is our home. This is our child. We will face him together." Kyle looked at the fierce determination in her eyes and saw not a liability to be protected, but a partner. He nodded grimly. They would make their stand here. They worked through the night. Kyle barricaded the windows and reinforced the door. He laid out his rifle and ammunition. He showed Serafina how to load and fire the spare pistol, her hands surprisingly steady. As they worked, the wind began to rise, not the hot, dry wind of summer, but a strange moaning gale that carried the scent of rain and distant dust. A sandstorm was brewing, a monstrous, churning wall of red closing in from the west. It would arrive with Holt's army. The land itself was preparing for war. The storm hit just after noon, a blinding, choking maelstrom that reduced visibility to a few feet. The world beyond the cabin walls became a screaming chaos of wind and sand. And out of that chaos, they came. 13 riders, wraith-like figures emerging from the swirling red dust, their faces masked by bandanas, their eyes squinting against the gale. Holt led them, a monstrous silhouette on a powerful black horse. Beside him rode Sterling Croft, his face a pale mask of terror and resentment. Cale Holt's voice was a ragged roar, barely audible over the storm. "Send out the woman. Send out my property. Do it, and I may let you live, savage." Silence was their only reply. The gunmen dismounted, fanning out, using the storm as cover. The valley erupted into a cacophony of cracking rifles and the angry whine of ricochets. Inside the dim cabin, Kyle was a study in deadly calm. He moved between the barricaded windows, never wasting a shot, his rifle speaking with grim authority. Serafina stayed low, reloading the spare rifle, her hands moving with a focused precision that belied the frantic pounding of her heart. This was not a fight for her life, but for the life within her. The siege wore on, a brutal war of attrition, fought in the disorienting fury of the storm. As dusk began to fall, turning the red haze to a bruised purple, an impatient Holt roared a new command. "Burn them out? I want him dead, but I want her alive." Through the cracks in the wall, Serafina saw 2 men advancing with torches, the flames struggling valiantly against the wind. They were going to be burned alive. "A hunter does not wait for the wolves in his den," Cale said, his voice tight. He pressed the spare pistol into her hand. "Bar the door behind me." Before she could protest, he slipped out the small back window and was instantly swallowed by the storm. The wind and sand were his allies now. The next minutes were an eternity of terror. She was alone, the sounds of the storm and the splintering of wood as the gunmen attacked the door, her only company. Then a choked scream from the darkness cut short. Another, a single sharp rifle shot from an unexpected direction. Kyle was hunting them. He moved like a phantom through the blinding storm, his knowledge of the terrain absolute. He turned their cover into a trap, his arrows silent messengers of death, his rifle cracking from a new position each time. Panic seized Holt's men. They were fighting a ghost. Sterling, his nerve completely broken, made a run for his horse. He managed to scramble into the saddle, but as he wheeled the terrified animal around, a figure loomed out of the dust. Cale. Sterling screamed and fired his pistol wildly. The shot went wide. Cale didn't kill him. He simply struck the horse on its flank, sending the animal bolting blindly into the storm, carrying its shrieking rider away into the violent unknown. Only Holt and two of his most hardened gunmen remained. They took cover behind the corral, firing blindly into the swirling dust. "He's over there," Holt bellowed, pointing. As his men rose to fire, Serafina saw her chance. She jammed the pistol through a crack in the door and fired. The shot was a prayer, but it was answered. One of the gunmen cried out, clutching his leg as he fell. The other turned toward the cabin in surprise. It was the only opening Cale needed. An arrow hissed out of the storm and found its mark. Now only Holt was left. He stood alone beside the corral, a pathetic, wheezing figure, his hired army gone, his meticulous plan in ruins. Kyle emerged from the dust, his rifle held loosely at his side. He was covered in a thick coat of red sand, looking like an avenging spirit born of the earth itself. The cabin door creaked open, and Serafina stepped out, the pistol still in her hand. She stood beside Cale, a united, unbreakable front. Holt stared at them, his face a mask of disbelief and apoplectic rage. He looked at Cale, the man who had undone him. Then he looked at Serafina, at her fierce, defiant eyes, at the undeniable swell of her belly beneath her simple dress. He saw the end of his vengeance and the birth of a new legacy he could not stop. The sight finally shattered him. "It was all mine," he rasped, his voice a pathetic whimper. "He took it all. My Cora. My son." He raised his pistol, his hand trembling, aiming it not at Cale, but at Serafina's stomach. But he never fired. A shot cracked from the ridge, overlooking the valley. Holt jerked a look of profound surprise on his face. A dark stain spread across his chest. He stumbled backward and fell, his dead eyes staring up into the red swirling sky. Cale and Serafina spun toward the ridge. A lone figure stood there, rifle in hand. As the wind momentarily cleared the dust, they recognized the uniform. It was Sheriff Gable, and behind him were a half-dozen armed townsmen. It seemed that even a pliable lawman had his limits, and Corcoran Holt's private war had finally crossed it. Gable had followed the posse not to help them, but to stop them. The storm began to subside as quickly as it had arrived. The wind died to a mournful sigh, and a strange, calm silence fell over the valley, broken only by the groans of the wounded. The battle was over. In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened in the valley became a fractured legend in Redemption Gulch. The official report was that Holt and a posse of hired guns, crazed by greed, had been killed while illegally attempting to seize Apache land. Sheriff Gable, hailed as a hero, was happy to leave it at that. The deeper truths of betrayal and vengeance were buried with Corcoran Holt. Sterling Croft was never seen again, swallowed by the desert or his own cowardice. Serafina, now heavy with child, knew she had one last thing to do. She and Cale rode to her father's ranch. They found Bartholomew Hayes on the porch, staring out at the empire he had built on a foundation of lies. He had heard the news of Holt's death and looked like a man who had aged 20 years in a month. Serafina dismounted and walked toward him. She felt no hatred, no desire for revenge, only a vast, weary pity. She stopped before him and held out the locket. "I believe this belongs to you," she said, her voice clear and steady. He stared at the silver oval, his face turning ashen. "I know everything, Father," she continued. "About Cora Holt, about the mine, about the lies, all of it." She opened the locket, revealing the initials and the deed within. This was his proof. It's why he wanted me. To finish what you started. To leave you with nothing. Bartholomew crumpled, his harsh, unyielding frame finally breaking. He sank into his chair, a broken man, the architect of his own ruin. I am not your legacy, Seraphina said, her voice softening. My child is not your legacy. They belong to a new story, one of honesty and of love. She closed the locket and placed it gently on the railing beside him. She turned without another word and walked back to Cale. She did not look back as they rode away, leaving Bartholomew Hayes alone with the ghosts of his own making a king in a kingdom of ash. Months later, on a clear, cool autumn day, Seraphina stood before a simple wooden cross on a small hill overlooking the valley. Her mother's grave. In her arms, wrapped in soft tan deerskin, slept her son. She had named him Nayland for the wind. For a long time she had kept the locket a cold, hard reminder of the tangled lies of her past. But it was not a story she wanted her son to inherit. She had come here today to bury it, to leave it with the woman who had kept its secrets. But as she looked at the grave, at the peaceful valley, at the child in her arms, she realized that the locket and its pain no longer had any power over her. Instead, she took from her pocket a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, a gift from Cale. Its wings were outstretched, poised for flight. It was a symbol not of the past, but of the future. A symbol of her new family, of her own identity forged in fire and love. She placed the wooden bird at the base of the cross, a promise of a new beginning. Years passed. The story of the coyote and the hawk faded into the dust of memory. But in a small, sheltered valley, a new story was being written. It was the quiet truth of a family. Of a boy with his mother's steady eyes and his father's gentle strength, a child of two worlds, thriving under the vast desert sky. Their life was not a legend whispered by others, but a testament strong and rooted to the resilience of the human heart.